Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, David, for having me. How's the sound? You probably know that it sounds really weird, echoey. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. Okay, just, start, shout if you don't, okay? Yeah, thank you for having me. As you mentioned, I'm a theorist. I do stuff that falls under the umbrella of media theory, whatever that means, and I write on slightly different ways of understanding media, kind of a historical focus, but also, let's say, experimental focus. Not only about experimental practices that we can excavate from media art history, but also theory as an experiment itself, right? Okay. As mentioned, I wrote about insects, and I've written about computer viruses as well, and mostly about digital culture. And today's talk is going to be more about media art, so to speak, but actually the key thrust of the talk is going to be about materiality, okay? And more recently, I've been writing about media archaeology, which kind of relates to our topic today as well. But actually, we're going to be really concretely about geology, and I'll explain what. I guess the key context of the whole talk is so-called material turn in media theory and cultural theory, but also media art and media artistic practices. In a way, it's if you want a one-liner, it's something about questioning the medium and the materiality of the medium beyond medium specificity, and actually questioning what does it mean to be specific about the media we work with, okay? And obviously, it's not only about digital media in this sense. So, in a way, one could say, in a theoretical vein, that it's about certain kind of ecological understanding of media, right? Or what kind of forces, material, energetic, and conceptual forces contribute to the way in which, for instance, media and art gets born, right? What gives birth to mediatic expressions, to media, and material construction of artistic practices? But as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about deep times, alternative deep times. I'm going to explain what that means, and how that might be relevant for artistic practices, media theory, art theory even. In a kind of slightly wonky take, I admit, but that's much more interesting than do the mainstream one, right? Okay. This talk has got 4 parts. It's going to be pretty basic academic talk, so bear with me. I'll start with the bizarre lessons of Professor Challenger, the Arthur Conan Doyle character from the story When the World Screamed, from about 100 years ago. The idea that the Earth is alive, and its crust is alive too, that stratification is a living double articulation that shows how geology is much more dynamic than just dead matter, okay? It starts with a letter. The novel starts with a letter, an undated letter addressed to Mr. B.L.S. Jones, expert of the artesian drilling. The letter is a request for assistance. The nature of what is required is not specified in the letter, but the reputation of this mad scientist precedes him. The slightly volatile personality of Professor Challenger. Escorted with suspicion and curiosity, it soon becomes evident that indeed Mr. Jones's drilling expertise is needed in Sussex. At Hengist Down, Professor Challenger is engaged in a rather secret drilling operation, although it remains for a long time unclear what sort of a job the special machinery is needed for. Even the sort of material to be penetrated is slightly different from what is expected, not so much about drilling chalk or clay, or the usual geological formations, but more of a jelly-like substance. The Earth is alive, and that this vitality, this aliveness, can be actually very experimentally proved is Challenger's mission in the novel. It didn't start with undated letter, obviously, but Professor Challenger has for a longer time drilled deeper and deeper through the Earth's crust until it has finally ended up so deep so as to find a layer that pulsates like a living animal. Indeed, new mechanisms of drilling are needed, hence his letter to Mr. P.L.S. Jones. But this mechanism is needed to penetrate a different sort of a substance. Instead of drilling for petroleum or drilling to make mines for coal or other valuable for which men usually dig holes in the ground, Challenger's mission is just to prove a point. Beyond the strata of, quote, sallow lower chalk, the coffee-colored Hastings beds, the lighter Ashburnham beds, the dark carboniferous clays gleaming in the electric light, band after band of jet black sparkling coal alternative with the rings of clay, unquote, one finds the layers which most clearly prove the point. It was suddenly as if undeniable. Even non-organic matter is alive. There's a life of the non-organic. There's a life of the earth and its crust. Quote, the throbs were not direct, but gave the impression of a gentle ripple or rhythm which ran across the surface, unquote. Mr. Jones describes the deep surface they found. And I quote again, the surface was not entirely homogeneous, but beneath it, seen as through a ground glass, there were dim whitish patches of vacuoles which varied constantly in shape and size, unquote. The whole layers, the core, the strata, it was all throbbing. It pulsated, it animated. Hence, it is not even necessary to go into similar lengths as Professor Challenger does in the novel, in what I would call is one of the most bizarre rape-like scenes in literature, when he penetrates that jelly-esque layer just to make the earth scream in his scientific sadism. The sound of, I quote, thousands of sirens in one, paralyzing all the great multitude with its fierce insistence and floating away through the still summer air until it went echoing along the whole south coast, and even reach our French neighbors across the channel. So basically, around the time of writing of that novel, as I said, about 100 years ago, right, early 20th century, this kind of a push, slightly mad push of going deeper, was evident in obviously in other fields than just fiction. For instance, copper. Copper had become a crucial material requirement for technical media culture since the 19th century, because obviously, naturally, and hence the dependence on copper mining. A lot of the early mines were, however, exhausted by the start of the early 20th century, leading to this kind of a new Challenger-like push, okay? New drills, deeper mining that now meant to provide for an increasing international need and systematic and yet environmentally very wasteful use in wires and network culture, copper wires. The birth of network culture with copper wires. Indeed, besides such contemporary contexts of mining where Challenger's madness actually starts to make sense, one is tempted to think about the biopolitics of petroleum drilling in a manner that the theorist, kind of a fiction theory writer, Reza Negarestani outlined in his weird speculative take, Cyclonopedia. And obviously, another example from our time, we shouldn't be forgetting the earth screams caused by hydraulic fracturing, or as we know it from popular media, fracking. That besides the promise that it might change the geopolitical balance of energy production, also points towards what is often neglected in the discourse of geopolitics. When we talk about geopolitics, we don't usually talk about geos, the actual earth, the soil, and the crust. This is a perspective to media and with a relevance to art as well that I want to actually be, pointing towards. And a perspective to think about ecology, but also media ecology, very literally, right? Literally in the sense that it digs towards the bowels of the earth, as the epigraph from Ovid said, concretely like in mining operations, which brings us the essential minerals and materials that are actually necessary for building of media. That's going to be one key thing that I'm going to be talking about. Minerals, and why minerals and metals and geology matters when you talk about media and when we talk about material practices, right? And in short, of direct relevance to our current media technological discourse and practices is the fact, a reminder we take statistics from a couple of years back that remind about how media and materiality are very metallic. 36% of all tin, 25% of cobalt, 15% of palladium, 15% of silver, 9% of gold, 2% of copper, and 1% of aluminum goes annually to media technologies only. The reason why I'm starting with the famous story by Conan Doyle, a slightly mad story, relates to death and living matter, of engaging with a materiality that itself is constantly articulating and dynamic as a formation. And basically, there's a whole, I won't go into philosophical details in my talk, really, but, if you're into, let's say, contemporary debates in philosophy, there's a huge range of stuff that debates about non-human. The non-human term is a term that is used, okay? Speculative realism, new materialism, all of which, in one way or another, seem to be arguing that we need to understand materiality of non-humans as living, obviously. That things are dynamic, things are not just passive, inert matter waiting for a form, whether that's an art theorist or somebody else, to give it life. That things, materiality is teeming with life, and constantly, even if perhaps slowly, like geological formations, articulating itself and living. As said, I'm not going to be going into philosophical discourse that much, or internal explications of philosophical discourse from Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, the French philosophers who also wrote about this kind of materiality, dynamic materiality. But I'm interested in deep times. I'm interested in deep times in a different way. Deep time of the media. A concept that is less explicitly about Professor Challenger than about a different professor, Professor Zielinski, an actual person. Professor Zielinski, who works at University of Arts Berlin and who's became famous for his writings on media archaeology and deep excavations of media histories. And basically interactions between art, science, and technology. In short, what I will elaborate in more detail soon, the notion of deep time is for Zielinski a sort of a media archaeological gesture that while it borrows from paleontology, right, the notion of deep time, actually turns out to be a riff to understand the longer-term durations of art and science collaboration in Western and non-Western contexts. So all this stuff that we hear constantly in discourses of digital economy and digital culture about interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, about art and science collaboration, art and engineering collaborations, actually isn't very new. That's the main kind of a drift of what Zielinski is doing in his very concrete elaborations. But I want to argue that there's actually a need for a more literal understanding of deep time as well. Literal in the sense that it really talks about geology and materiality through that, okay? Both in terms of deepness as well as temporality, especially when it comes down to media technologies and, of course, relevance to any kind of discourse of media ecology. Professor Challenger was introduced to give us a necessary, even if slightly dubious, point about matter as living and geology as a force of its own. The dynamics of non-linear history, so to speak. History that is not so much interested in great men or great women, historical facts that we usually get when you do your first year introduction to history course, but actually a sort of a weird history that actually looks at also human history from the point of view of rocks, plants, and other kind of a natural phenomena, right? So, in a way, if this is a media ecological take, then it's definitely a non-organic media ecological take. And I'm not going to be talking about, despite my earlier work on insect media, I'm not going to be talking about bees and flowers or insects and swarms, or other sorts of ecological metaphors from the plant world, or animals. But I'm going to be talking about very hard things. Geology, minerals, psychogeophysics, and other approaches which basically are speculative takes on the material basis of media and technology. So this is something I want to proceed with one eye towards the emerging critical discourse of resource depletion, minerals, and even the kind of even harder materiality than just hardware, right? So, that has been, you don't need to do, media theory, but that's my own sin. I always am stuck with media theory, but, the go-to for media studies and media theory always is going back to German media theory when they want to talk about materiality, and then they talk about the materiality of hardware, right? Of science and engineering. But then actually what I want to argue is that there's even a harder materiality than hardware, and that's something I'm going to be elaborating as well. This is the layer which actually makes even hardware possible, right? What hardware itself consists of and is composed. This is the layer which anyone dealing with contemporary media technologies and digital culture should be thinking about. And this, again, despite the, buzz in the UK, especially after the Tory government came in, the buzz about software cultures, backed up by Tories' narrow desire to reform school education, to take into account coding skills, our understanding of the materiality of digital culture has remained as shallow, as narrow as Tory politics. Instead, we just need to be pushing much further in understanding media and technology than talking about coding skills or software as essential for future businesses. I want to basically elaborate this geological angle towards media and art materialism, that all those technologies that seem soft, light, mobile, and codable are actually environmentally hazardous. Even thinking about hardware materialism isn't always hard enough. And if we want to extend our material notions of media thoroughly towards deep time matter and deeper matter and deeper times, and this is one of the things I'm going to be elaborating, we need to be understanding, okay, media through what is non-media in it, okay? I'll explain later. And we'll come to some media artistic examples as well. So what is this? What do I mean by, this weird talk about material sciences and media and so forth? There's at least two ways of understanding it, and these are the two poles around which I'm going to be talking about, very concrete examples. Basically, in research and design, fabrication and standardization of new materials that allow for mediatic and high technology processes to emerge. If you look at history, there wouldn't be modern technical media or modern culture without history of chemistry, as well as product development, aluminum and other synthetic materials that are so crucial for modernity, alongside the work of material sciences that actually make our computer culture possible as well. Silicon, but also germanium, of course. And now, this is an image of what I'm talking about, the minuscule 22 nanometer transistor that actually is the first one to function without silicon, made of indium, gallium arsenide, and demonstrate that a lot of chemistry and product development has to happen before the discursive wizardry of creative technology kicks in. And then the other pole of materiality, junk, garbage, waste. The one that is less high-tech, it seems, and more about obsolescence and depletion. The mined rare earth minerals essential for computers and in general high-tech industries from entertainment to military. A range of materials that leak out concretely when planned obsolescence make sure that things get replaced quick enough and leave a different sort of a media materiality than we usually consider. A media materiality of toxins that get released through riverside dumping, incarceration, and so forth. Okay, as said, media materiality needs to talk about non-organic things, whether that's something really weird that I don't really understand of what what, for instance, a 22 nanometer transistor that works on indium gallium arsenide is. I don't need to. Or then the junk that gets discarded with an increasing pace of hundreds of millions of all still functioning electronic equipment alone in the US get discarded every year. And it also reminds that things are not just things in the clearly delineated object sense. They're not always easily graspable as objects suited for the hand, especially when talking about chemicals and other high-tech material sciences. So for those of you who know the philosophers Deleuze and Guattari, from their talk about geology of morals, as they once wrote in their 1000 Plateau, we should be moving towards the geology of media as well, and psychogeophysics of mediatic environments, a way to look at media artistic practice that doesn't only talk about metaphorics of deep time. But before we actually start to critique that, I want to actually go back a couple of steps and actually talk about what Zielinski understands by deep time, right? And what does this notion of deep time mean for media art and media art histories? So, okay, as said, the title of my talk is a reference to the more famous take on deep times by Professor Zielinski. And his notion of deep time of the media towards an archaeology of hearing and seeing by technical means that also got translated into English about 6 years ago. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he's one of the main figures in the field of media archaeology, so to speak. Basically, it's an attempt, and it's a good attempt, to pick up on the idea of geological times to guide the way in which we think about humanities-focused topics of media arts and digital culture. It basically kicks off as a critique. It kicks off as a critique of too teleological, too narrow, and too linear, too rationalized notions of time and media evolution that sees the theme of progress embedded in the nature and narrative of the devices. The idea that new technologies are increasingly better and they need to be replacing the old technologies, and there's like a simplistic tree of progression that defines our technological cultures. That kind of critique isn't that new. Anyone who's done a bit of media studies and a bit of cultural studies knows that already. 20, 30 years of media and cultural studies have really taught us that technological things and mediatic things are not automatically rational, better, or in any way progressive. And also what Zielinski does, as part of his critique, and all this talk about new, or there's new media or new artistic practices and so forth, there's always something new in the old and old in the new, and also in the world of technological inventions. This applies to his notion of art as well. So basically, Zielinski's media archaeological, and as he calls it, unarchaeological approach, however, picks up on the notion of time that actually, it benefits from this geological metaphor of deep time that it uses early on. In order to understand where he's coming from, let's go back, let's rewind a couple of 100 years back, and debates concerning the religious temporal order versus the growing, quote, evidence of immense qualitative geological changes, which in the late 18th century were one of the expressions of actually articulating this kind of a division between biblical time, of what, about 6,000 years, waiting for the Messiah, and then geological times, which new scientific practices were keen to introduce and revolutionize our way of understanding the world. And obviously, talking in the Darwin room, this is a grounding of how Darwin is basically, okay, what does Darwin do? Okay, this is just a footnote. What does Darwin do? The key thing about Darwin, okay, all the stuff about animals, evolution, and so forth, brilliant. Darwin, besides that, is a thinker of time. Darwin gives a brilliant, weird, non-human notion of time, and that was his most radical, heritage that we've got. The time is unfolding in a very unlimited way, but that was already grounded in a lot of stuff that was happening for at least 100 years before him, including people in geology. Okay? So people I'm talking about and people that Zielinski refers to are for instance, James Hutton. James Hutton's theory of the Earth from 1778. For Hutton, deep time. Depth means time. Under the layers of granite, you find further strata of slate signaling the existence of deep temporalities. What he's doing, Hutton, is as a geologist in the late 18th century, is proposing an immensity of time and an openness of the future, right? Sounds very Darwinian. Despite his use of terms such as continual succession when talking of the time of the Earth and geology, his ideas about geology are surrounded by this feeling for endlessness in a positive way. What Zielinski does is, actually, he says that, look, what if we start thinking about cultural times in a similar manner? And not just cultural times, but also times of media artistic practices, ideas in media art, and ideas in media technologies, right? So he picks up on Hutton, but he also picks up on more recent, really famous writers like Stephen Jay Gould. Stephen Jay Gould's paleontological explanations and ideas that emphasize the notion of variation. This is the reason why Zielinski also talks about variantology, okay? Variation. So basically, despite the allure of beautifully structured hierarchical layers, the most important thing for these guys in paleontology and geology is that you can always go deeper. It's never a clean-cut, beautiful strata where you can find historical layers. You can, but that's just an abstraction. The key thing is variation. Going back in time means finding new and new and new variations that are not necessarily leading to our future, right? So he complexifies history and time into this kind of massive rhizomatic structure that could have gone various ways. So reading back in geological times actually becomes an exercise to think about variation, right? Difference, heterogeneous things. So that's why he picks up stuff from geological explanations and geological records. The idea that the Earth is dynamic, it's varying, it's alive, and it's alive in its constant articulation. And again, a slight nod towards Professor Challenger. This is a softcore, the non-fiction version of Professor Challenger. So Zielinski picks up some these kind of geological metaphors and notions like variation and deep time and applies this to thinking about art practices and media art. Of deep times, of the ways in which we modify, manipulate, create, and recreate means of hearing and seeing. Okay? So, for him, art is about manipulation of the senses. Media is about manipulation of the senses. His is a perspective to the world of inventors, imaginations, and experimental practices, experiments in the world that preceded the very recent talk of media arts, to demonstrate that the ideas of mediated environments, sensory manipulation, engineering as a form of art practice, and so forth, have actually been around for hundreds, even thousands of years. So he takes such ideas as his gravity points. Zielinski introduces what are really, I would say, inspirational deep times of apparatuses, ideas, solutions, completely mad imaginary ideas that have no scientific basis, but are more likely to be part of history of philosophy, for instance. He also admits one curious thing that I want to pick up on. He admits that his approach is ever so slightly romantic. And he doesn't even dismiss that critique. And paradoxically, on the one hand, he talks about deep times of the media, right? Of these geological non-human times. But actually, when you start reading the book, it's all about heroes and heroines. And mostly about male heroes, actually. Figures such as Empedocles, the pre-Socratic philosopher who gave us the four elements: fire, air, water, and earth. Or then he talks about his heroes like the Jesuit priest Athanaeus Kircher. Or, for instance, the operatic dreams of Joseph Judy and his early audiovisual telegraph system from the late 18th century. And also how Judy, before, composed an opera on the topic, the telegraph or teletypewriter, and and which, of course, is quite interesting because you didn't really have telegraphs back then. Or other examples of these weird excavations into imaginations and experimental practices. The opium-fueled mediatic dreams of the slightly masochistically inclined Jan Evangelista Purkunia, a Czech from the early 20th century, early 19th century, for a taste of using actually his own body for various experiments with drugs and electricity. Okay, that doesn't sound that weird, no. But still, what he did, and what film historians usually point to, is that with these drug and electricity experiments, he was actually experimenting with his own body as a medium. Basically, what does it do? What does the body do and see with some electricity or some substances? Some things make you see red, some things make you see blue, some things make you see circles, some things make you see squares. These are from his drawings as well. And basically introducing this really funky idea that actually your body is a medium that can be manipulated with substances, electricity, and so forth. Don't try it at home. All of this is very fascinating, and Zielinski's book is really a kind of wonderful book into the weirdness of these experimental practices that are relevant for media artistic. And, well, in general, consider the notion of media here in a very broad sense, okay? I want to suggest that we can actually pick up on the more geological, concrete implications of his metaphorics. With a theoretical hard hat on, I wonder if there's actually more to his use of the notion of deep time and temporality and deepness, as well as geology, that actually, as I mentioned, really strangely in an interesting way resonate with a lot of the stuff that's happening in philosophy, cultural theory, art discourses even. What if there is a concrete deep time of the media that expands, for the sake of this talk, to at least two directions? Deepness and geology in terms of how they actually make possible any kind of mediatic ecology or mediatic environment of digital culture. And how can we theorize this kind of a deep time that is concrete? I'll tell you soon one suggestion. And secondly, time, temporality. Understood, very concretely linked to non-human times, right? Non-human times, that is a recurring theme in geological literature, of course, but it's also a perspective that actually, what interests me is how it ties and gives us conceptual vocabularies to understand, for instance, the eco-crisis. Okay? Again, the catastrophe we're living, the eco-crisis, is actually, again, it's about time. It's about temporal scales that we're trying to understand. That doesn't fit in with political decision-making. It doesn't fit in with the time of capitalism. That is very short in terms of when it comes into the importance of petroleum. Okay, what, 100 years, 150 years of petroleum that is soon going to be extinct, but actually through petroleum taps into long-term durations, right? We need to understand non-human times to understand eco-crisis. We need to understand and other stuff as well. That's why I want to talk about media history of matter. How do we understand media history, not through the usual stories about mediatic devices, inventors, and whatever, but how do we understand media history from the perspective of, for instance, chemicals? Okay? Think of chemicals as an agent, as one key agency through which to understand media in itself. So, alternative accounts of deep time and materiality. One aspect with, again, a very concrete ecological edge to it is the acknowledgement of the growing waste problem having to do with discarded media technologies as well as power consumption, okay? I'm not going to be talking about energy too much, but it's essential here. This goes the other way than much of the recent digital economy discourse. What is taken up by business correspondents as a forthcoming change in business models is the emphasis that hardware is dirt cheap, and hardware is hence discardable. Hardware is dead, claims the business writer Jay Goldberg, when encountering first in China, then in the US, a tablet computer, for $40. And he goes on to narrate, I quote from this story. When I show this tablet to people in the industry, they have universally shared my shock, and they always ask, who made it? My Stock answer is, who cares? This is how far the Shenzhen electronics complex has evolved. The hardware maker literally doesn't matter. Contract manufacturers can download a reference design from the chip maker and build suit custom orders. This is the punchline. If I had 20,000 friends and an easy way to import these into the US, I would put my own name on it and hand them out as a business card or Hanukkah gifts. It's not a big surprise that in business discourse, people are not that interested in the actual hardness of hardware and persistence of hardware, of what happens if you have when you receive a business card, you know what happens to business cards. You bin them. You discard and abandon them. And same thing if you bin hardware, if you discard hardware, the difference is that it retains its toxic materiality of production. There's a different kind of a death in hardware than he's talking about from the business perspective. This is the chemical duration of something that's going to leak out. And it's an interesting kind of a take on, if you know the notion of dead media from about 50 years back by the science fiction writer Bruce Sterling. This is a different kind of a take on dead media as well. Not only dead media in the sense that all the stuff that we don't use anymore, right? But also media that doesn't die. I've written in other contexts about zombie media with the California-based hardware hacker, circuit bend artist Garnet Hurd, and zombie media as a way to understand that, well, it's a long story, but hardware never dies. Even if you discard that, it's going to be shipped somewhere, potentially, extracted for material extraction, or then just leaking out its toxic chemicals through riverside dumping and so forth. Zombie media also refers to practices of reuse as an artistic practice, but I'm not going to go into that. So from this guy's, Goldberg's business sense, and how this cheapness of hardware is actually going to change software business models, blah, 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 we need to go to something more gloomy and more apocalyptic to realize the amount of electronic waste we discard every year. Millions, hundreds of millions of electronic devices that are still operational, besides being operational, they're packed with hazardous material, lead, cadmium, mercury, barium, and so forth. This is, by the way, from photographic art of Pieter Hugo, Permanent Error. These are only a couple of examples of materialities that actually constitute our information technology. It includes a wide range of examples of refined minerals, metals, and chemicals that are essential for media to be produced and function. Again, we've been really keen to understand media, to use the kind of a notion that McLuhan introduced, and understanding artistic media. But we've forgotten also that how on a massive level it depended on these kind of material networks. When we talk about materiality of media, we rarely talk about lead or cadmium. With a much too one-sided way, we have tried to approach media only as media and ignored this much lower physical part on which media takes place. Hence, we need to be aware of geology of media with its own connections to organic layers of ecology. So just like recent years of media art has been increasingly interested in insects and plants and other non-human things, organic, we should be also considering geological temporalities, durations of soil and chemicals as this kind of a low-level hum, a different materiality where I would almost use the word grounded materiality as a pun. Such a materiality involves so much in terms of politics and policy, which registers in the amount of governmental acts it triggers. For instance, EU policy level. EU policy is trying to keep up to date with the growing amount of electronic waste, but also the future economic directions that are planned and realized that actually future economic directions, talking about advanced technology futures of EU, they start below the turf. Below the turf, besides a discourse of digital economy, creative industries, and all that blah, 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 software Europe of creativity, this acknowledgement of criticality of raw materials is identified as crucial for any kind of a long-term socio-economic change. and this is usually where EU policy goes, uh-oh, when they realize that actually it's places like China, Russia, Brazil, Congo, and for instance, South Africa. Oopsie, I should have one slide, but I don't have it, okay. Are in a crucial position when considering the futures of digital culture as well, because they're producers of raw materials, rare earth minerals as well, and alternative material futures of technological culture. Kinds of hotspots, right? Hotspots for materiality of future technological societies. And it also comes with the realization that materiality of media cultures starts from the soil, and it starts underground. It starts at 500 meters underground, perhaps even deeper, when the realization that Earth's crust is, of course, dozens of kilometers deep. It points to the need for cobalt, gallium, indium, tantalum, and other minerals for capacitators, displays, batteries, and so forth. Obviously, it's not only about iPhones and entertainment technologies, but military technologies, for instance. There wouldn't be one drone flying without rare earth minerals. And this kind of underground is something that you don't usually talk in art schools. You talk about underground art, you talk about underground activism, but what if you talk about concrete underground? The underground of mining, and it also differs from Zielinski's deep time underground. This alternative deep time of the media is more in tune with mining practices and transportation of raw material logistics and persistence of these kinds of realities that include both hardware and hard work, okay? Hardware and hard work, both at the compiling and dismantling ends of hardware. Pick up the notion of hardware and hard work from a small art project, iMine, that you can Google and you'll find it, which has to do with mining of coltan, which is one of the minerals from Congo that gets often into public media even. Okay. In this way, media history is one big story of experimentation with different materials, from glass plates to chemicals, from selenium to coltan, from dilute sulfuric acid to shellac silk, and classic insulation material like the one extracted from Gutaperca trees in South America, which was crucial for insulation of underwater cables that came with the promise of global network society in the midst of the 19th century. That wouldn't have happened without that particular insulation material that made the copper wires insulated in a proper way. So we're deep in the Atlantic. And processes that I don't really understand what they're about, crystallization, ionization, and so forth. Or the new materials that I already mentioned that might be replacing silicon as the base for transistors and all of our digital culture devices. Indium, gallium arsenide, as one example of the weird realities, okay, behind mediatic phenomena. So when we talk about media, we don't even have to talk about software and algorithms, as we usually do when we start talking about digital culture. What if we start talking about molecular beam epitaxy, electron beam lithography, all of which are actually just normal semiconductor processes? A fiction example that gives the same message. Thomas Pynchon, the great weird American writer. Thomas Pynchon's Against the Day, a novel that is set in time actually much earlier than the age of transistors, and it's actually all about light. If you want to read a really brilliant novel about light as an artistic medium and light as part of modernity, then your go-to is Pynchon's Against the Day. But it's all about light for the use of technical media, such as photography, and you get the similar sense of chemistry of media. And I want to quote Pynchon here, okay? Quoting, "After going through all possible silver compounds, Merle, the character, moves on to salts of gold, platinum, copper, nickel, uranium, molybdenum, and antimony, abandoning metallic compounds after a while for resins, squashed barks, coal tar dyes, cigar smokes, wildflower extracts, urine from various critters, including himself, reinvesting what little money came in from portrait work into lenses, filters, glass plates, enlarging machines, so that soon the wagon was just a damn rolling photography lab. an understanding of photography actually from the material base onwards. So before any of the pictures were taken, whether the pictures were of lampposts to humans to trolley dynamos or flush toilets, there was a lot of chemistry and materiality happening already. So the question becomes, what if we understand these kinds of things, these kinds of experiments with materials, and I shouldn't be telling you this, you know this from studio work, these are already mediatic practices. They actually are essential experiments with materiality of media. What does matter afford, whether it's for high-tech media or something else? So, as said, material practices of experimentation with different reactions and combinations are also media and art practices. Our screen technologies and cables and networks, technical means of seeing and hearing, are partly results of meticulous and sometimes just purely accidental experimentation with how materials work, what works, what doesn't, whether you're talking of materials for insulation, conduction, projection, or recording. And you could extend that list. These are all, of course, very geeky historical details and geeky historical mapping, but it also reveals a bigger picture, and it reveals a bigger story that has to do with, that has the ecological edge to it. I won't go into talking about energy, but that would be a big topic in itself, and there's a lot of brilliant media scholars like Jean Cubitt who'd be pointing towards the fact that we need to understand, for instance, so-called immaterial digital technologies like cloud computing through the energy use. And in short, cloud computing uses a lot of energy. And that, of course, relates to big themes. The fact that these minerals, we might be actually running out of the minerals. Same goes with other kinds of resources. The key term is resource depletion. There's a wonderful book that you can find online, actually, for free, open access, called Depletion Design, which takes the notion of depletion and approaches from a certain artistic, design, and other perspective. Depletion design. You can Google it. Okay, now that we've been going from underground, that's not in underground art, to actually physics and entropy, and all that kind of stuff, at least, indirectly. Let me return to a couple of artistic examples, actually at least one, a slightly quirky one, but it it fits the bill. So this is going to be my last section. I want to talk through a couple of artistic examples, and then we've got time, hopefully, for Q&A. So, okay, one way to approach this deep time of the media, deep time in a more geological or alternative sense, is in a way to continue Zielinski's impulse and actually go back to media arts and artistic practices, right? So, okay, Zielinski's project is consistent and it's very inspiring, as we, got a glimpse of. And it's geographically broader than usual. He actually is one of the rare people that looks at media art histories and media artistic practices outside the Western context, mapping media artistic histories and weird histories of science and arts and engineering in South America, Middle East, China, and so forth. So hats off to Zielinski for doing that. And but what if we look at some of the contemporary work that revolves around geology, minerals, psychogeophysics, and other sorts of natural phenomena? I will focus only on one, that is a Berlin, London-based micro-research lab, Martin Hauser and Jonathan Kemp, primarily, and their work, micro-research lab, but I want to also acknowledge how many other directions we could have taken. Florian Dombois' artistic work on sonification of earthquakes, the recent-ish Übermorgen artistic group's work on the BP oil spill on the Gulf of Mexico that they pitched as a form of bioart, oil painting of massive scales, okay? It's actually a wonderful project about, how oil painting is back on a massive scale, the stuff that happened in the Gulf of Mexico. The various practices of reappropriation, of glitching and hardware hacking that actually take that obsolescent discarded material and reuse that, circuit bending, hardware hacking, Joyce Hinderding's work on natural electromagnetic stuff as resources for media artistic practices. Douglas Kahn writes about that. I think he should have a book coming out on the topic. So there's a lot of practices that deal with natural phenomena, as well as materiality of, for instance, discarded technology, okay? And it fits the bill in the sense that it seems to be in artistic practices where you find a head-on engagement with this quirky sort of materiality, weird materiality, that doesn't really immediately appeal or fit in with our sense of when we talk about media art and media artistic practices. But it still has been. Artistic practices such as psychogeophysics that takes up on the situationist techniques of psychogeography, but extends that to natural environments and phenomena, gravity, radiation, tectonic shifts, soil, geology, and more. So, psychogeography is the certain kind of artistic practice as well of urban mapping, activist and artistic method to tap into urban space and its effects on our cognitive, affective, and social patterns. But actually, psychogeophysics wants to push deeper. They want to extend to focus on non-human times, which still connect the psychic sphere in the manner that the dead novelist J.G. Ballard pitched. Basically, the insides turned out and vice versa. Landscapes of the mind are literally the physical surroundings of urban space, of boardwalks to malls, of autobahn to parking lots. But in psychogeophysics, this has to do with long durations of, for instance, geology and geological formations. And I'm going to quote from kind of a call or manifesto of psychogeophysics from the London Summit of Psychogeophysics from a couple of years back. And it goes like this. Psychogeographers are laughed at in the same streets they adore. A mountain is more important than Paris. A volcano is more important than Cairo. An earthquake is more important than Dubai. The geomagnetic north is more important than all the cities in Americas together. 1 billion+ years of void. Los Angeles sinks into the ocean. Geophysics, not geography, defines us. Latitude, longitude systematics cannot contain Earth masses on the move. Mount Fuji does not need Google Earth. So what you can see is, of course, this kind of provocative take that actually kind of dispossesses, kind of wants to get rid of the more recent talk about geolocation, mobilization of the urban space as smart and proprietary Internet of Things and all that kind of stuff, which has, of course, afforded a lot of interesting art projects as well, and wants to get its hands dirty. And these kind of calls have a specific relation to the ecological and geological. It doesn't come out as a nostalgic call for nature, but more of a speculative inquiry into what constitutes computer technology. And as I mentioned, this is really clearly voiced, for instance, projects by Martin Hauser and the Micro Research Lab Berlin, London. For instance, slightly freaky project in a good way, Hauser's Earth Code. In the project, the computer is experimentally set into a continuum with the Earth in order to measure the capacity of the Earth to boot a computer. Okay? This is not metaphor, but actual concrete practice. On a practical level, Hauser's DIY tinkering of how do you actually boot your computer directly from the Earth and not from your hard drive and the necessary booting instructions that are usually in code. This means experimenting with custom-made code and what he calls telluric operating system. He hooks the computer directly to the soil in order to measure and sample what he calls Earth voltages and converting these directly into instructions for an earth-booting computer. There's a wonderful short video by Arte, the TV channel, where he kind of explains this as well. So obviously, booting your computer directly from the Earth, even with your special code, is not that easy. But varying success, in most cases, is actually just a blinking empty screen, blinking cursor. But it has booted in weird ways as well. Hauser explains the conceptual aim. He talks about the idea of a vampiric Earth that allows to bypass the proprietary dirty mineral mining chains that otherwise afford the construction of hardware, such as hard drives. So every time you boot your computer, you need hardware, right? You need hard drives and other kinds of equipment, hardware that sustains code. But that hardware itself is constructed from various material practices, including mining of those rare earth minerals, which are, of course, part of big corporate chains of mineral production, some of which are involved in very dubious practices as well. Most often mentioned is the mining of coltan in Congo and the mining of coltan as part of the really bloody wars, civil wars in Congo that's been going on for years and years and years. So that's how you bypass the corporate construction of hardware. Instead, Earth itself is inserted into a relation with computing technology in a manner that is less idealistic than in mathematics. All this kind of formalized talk about the world as a cellular automata. This kind of approach is dirtier, full of soil. It is also geological. And he talks about the substrate. Substrate is a leading figure for the narrativization of this experimental setting that has been also seen as part of a material turn for media arts by people like Mitchell Whitelaw. But besides the vague term of material that I tend to use so often as well, let us not beat around the bush. This is actually a mineral, a soil, a geological term for the media arts. It's an alternative deep time of hundreds of millions of years. Time of media starts hundreds of millions of years back. The substrate is for Hauser and for the project pages a reference to the mined semiconductor base, which is later doped, etched, imprinted on other minerals and materials within a complex industrial process to form an electronic gate, a processing unit, the core of a network machinery that surrounds us. And I'm working towards conclusions soon as well, just going through a couple of things. And because he characterizes this in relation to all the discourse in computer technology and computer science is about abstract machines, but it actually pushes the logic of abstract machines to an extent that it actually becomes geological. Basically, and I quote, he goes on to explain this is so wonderful and weird stuff, and I need to quote it. He talks about the mineral necessity of the substrate that is equally effaced. And he talks about logic gates that are, of course, the key thing about computers. Logic gates, and thus full of computers, can be constructed from water jets, from slime molds, with the former proving particularly useful within paranoid military scenarios as being resilient to high-energy electromagnetic attack. And he continues, despite software's abstraction, the geological maintains a particular attraction as Earth substrate, that which surrounds us, our material. Substrate equally presents a set of economic, political, and ecological consequences which contrast with software's lack of coded visibility, its inevitable encryption. Stories such as Bram Stoker's Dracula, itself based on an earlier catalogue of fictions, shift the question of material and substrate to the body. And he goes on to this weird rereading of Dracula. Dracula's viral code is enacted at the interface with a substrate, the freshly dug earth which is transported to London and distributed around the capital, this infection vector. So as you can see, his kind of old artistic method is really bizarre combination of DIY, very experimental constructions with code and hardware, and actually it's kind of completely loopy idea of actually booting a computer from the earth, and then narrativization through fiction. His earlier projects have done that with Pynchon and I think Ballard, and this one with a reference to Bram Stoker's Dracula and the idea that, you know, actually, what is Bram Stoker's Dracula about? Well, it's about contagious nature of the earth. You know, Dracula can't live without the earth. The earth is life for Dracula, okay? So I won't go into details, slightly wonky, but it's a wonderful, weird idea. So that's the double articulation he's trying to pitch and narrativize, but also experimentally set this connection between computer technology, mediatic technologies, and its relation to earth and the soil, okay? So To me, his projects, and this is from another one, are brilliant in its experimental ways of setting this parallel deep time of the media to that of Zielinski's. And for us, it's a good way of actually talking about materiality of media that actually goes into experimental settings with the earth, the substrate and soil. It also has the emphasis on minerals, right? Especially in the other projects that they did with Ryan Jordan, called the Crystal World, and the related ones, D and recrystallization, which through the figure of the crystal and the mineral investigated the concrete constitution of the computer, right? Itself a geological figure of stratification that can be opened up, exposed as a living machine of articulation of earth, as in minerals, rare earth minerals, and proprietary production chains and procedures. So this kind of a alternative deep time of media takes rocks seriously and extends media ecology to media geology. It's a speculative sort of a media materialism that takes on materiality through stratifications. And it's not all about media, but exposes the level on which media becomes media, right? Talking of minerals is not the same thing as talking about media, or for sure it's not the same thing as talking about artistic practices. But what if this is the wide layer on which we need to understand the continuum between cultural practices and artistic practices and ecological and geological contexts? So three things that are the crucial themes around which everything revolves now, okay? Firstly, geology. Also the deep time and the long time durations. What if we need to understand artistic practices not through time span that we usually learn in art history courses, but what if art history as well starts, let's say about 500 millions of years ago with the processes of mineralization, okay? Secondly, a media history of materials that are crucial for affording mediatic practices. And thirdly, the stuff that is the discarded, obsolete material and the possibilities of reusing electronic waste, rematerialization of with ecological consequences. These are what I would call the alternative deep times for media and artistic practices. I'm going to end here. Thank you.
I've got one to start off with, which might give some people time to think about.
Digest.
It's maybe a bit cheeky, but
oh, no.
Is the logic of what you're saying that if we don't have a kind of geological and ecological understanding of media, it's not the human that will die out, it will be media, and that all the hardware is going to form another layer like the dinosaurs?
It's probably going to happen anyway.
Is that what
Imagine.
Is that what you're also arguing?
Yeah. Imagine a future paleontologist, like, what, 500 million years in the future. What they're going to find is junk as a kind of a material residue of us. That's pretty much what's going to left. The same way that petroleum that affords this intensive phase of ultra-capitalism for about hundreds of years and is soon going to end out. That's, of course, dead organic matter that we know that has been, stratified over hundreds of millions of years. I can't remember how old oil is, but still. It's pretty much the same thing. And there's already a second ecology happening on a human level. The stuff that we discard, as we know, it doesn't disappear. A lot of it is shipped quite also illegally to places like China. China has banned import of electronic waste, but there's ways around it. Also, it's in a place in Africa. And it forms like a second economy of media as well, in terms of what do you extract, what kind of valuable materials you can extract, gold, tin, copper, and so forth from this stuff, and then the reuse as well, the stuff that works. So there's kind of it's about tweaking the ways in which we think about times in terms of strata and temporalities. And obviously it's kind of the philosopher Manuel de Landa, who wrote the book 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, and he talks about the past, 1,000 years of European history primarily through rocks and language, but also these kind of non-human actors. And another book he's got, he pictures the idea of a future robot historian, right? The future robot historians, probably when people are dead, and there's robot historians thinking about ancestors who built robots. In a similar way, the future robot paleontologist, looking at the kind of waste levels that they got, it's probably going to be a strata of various synthetic materials and others that are really condensed in this weird strata. Very, yeah.
Your example of is it Houseman?
Yeah, Martin Hauser.
Is it that you're interested in whether there's a possibility of a more direct relationship now of media to minerals? One, to sort of cut out capital capitalism, and two, because that's the only way media will survive, because the minerals are going to run out sometime in a mine.
Yeah, I mean, the more boring answer would be that exactly we need to be thinking about how we're going to reuse a lot of the rare earth minerals that we're not still doing, and how do we actually not discard them. So definitely there's kind of an idea about reuse, reappropriation, that actually this is where the two come together, right? DIY practices, history of reappropriation as an art practice, but actually also an ecological practice. And that was behind the workshops and piece of writing we did with Garnet Hurst called Zombie Media. Okay, two things. Media doesn't die because it always, it might not be media, but it's definitely your abandoned LCD screen is going to be somewhere. It doesn't disappear, as we know from physics, right? But zombie media also has the living dead of media that can be resurrected. The discarded piece of electronics can be resurrected with a bit of circuit bending, hardware hacking, into something new. So it taps into this idea of, existence of electronic waste as a huge, resource of materials that we need to be looking into. But it also looks at, obviously, history of art and techniques of reappropriation that we know from canon of 20th century art. But it also has that kind of a mediatic angle to it. So it kind of works on those various levels, if that makes sense. So definitely, I mean, I'm worried about stuff. We're probably going to, we'll die anyway, but Anthropocene.
Yeah, but you could, I won't
Yeah.
ask another question, but I think that someone like J.G. Ballard would be very interested in the idea that we will die out and there'll be a layer of something in the future.
Yeah, it's a very Ballardian idea, isn't it? That, there's going to be those kind of monuments, in a very concrete sense, monuments of this short period of intense electronic culture and petroleum culture.
Anyone else have a question?
This one. What I mean by deep time? Yes, it's basically, if you go back to Zielinski's way of understanding deep time, it's really is, let's go back to this, I'll show you this. It's a term, as I said, it's a term that comes from paleontology and, the people that actually deal and know something about geology, not just as humanities and art people talking about geology. Deep time is the stratification of Earth as, strata and layers, okay? And that's one sort of a popular understanding of it, where deepness and different strata correspond to different temporal layers as well, right? So it's the correspondence between deepness and temporal layers, through which you can understand, also the age of the Earth. And obviously it was a big shock for all those kind of Christian people in the 18th century that somebody comes with geological evidence saying that, it's actually a bit older than 6,000 years, and you can't find the truth in the Bible, and actually got geological evidence that things are a bit much older. And then it goes into, with Zielinski, it goes into this kind of idea that what if we pick up this geological notion and use that to think about media art? not just media art in the narrow sense that we get in electronic art festivals or popular media, understanding it as part of 20 years of, let's say 50 years of video art, electronic art practices, but actually what if you go back in time, and this is one of Zielinski's mantras, that you can always push back in time, see different variations, and use that as a kind of way to understand, really push back of what conceptually as well are the origins of, let's say, electronic media and arts. I'll give you an example. One of his kind of early examples in the book is Empedocles, the pre-Socratic philosopher who gave us the 4 elements, right? So what Zielinski does is he reads, and in this sense, Zielinski is a historian, right? He reads Empedocles' pre-Socratic philosophy of sensation as interface theory, right? That it gives us a theory of sensation and the world, and theory of interfaces. I'm talking about concrete computer interfaces. So it's a kind of a constant rewiring of seeing funky, weird ideas from the history of media and history of art and history of philosophy as something that you can rewire as part of our concerns that have to do with artistic practices and media and so forth. So it's kind of this weird back and forth movement as well that you got there. But it's true. I mean, it's very metaphorical, the way in which he picks up on deep times. And as I said, kind of one of the shortcomings is that he still focuses on, usually male heroes. Whereas we can actually ask very provocatively the question of what if you actually look at that kind of a strata that is, let's say 500 millions of years ago when mineralization started, what if that strata is actually much more important for our conceptual coordinates than something else from human history?
Is it, so is deep,
yeah.
Deep time in a way something that's indexed physically as well?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would say so as well.
A Greek philosopher comes up with an idea that in the future suddenly becomes
yeah. And I mean, it's not even going against his ideas, but it's like picking up on those. What if we become literal? It's the same thing that, when I did insect media is that, okay, this is going to be really short because we have a question coming. 20 years of media and also media arts, at least some of the digital arts, has been mad about insect metaphors, right? Distributed networks, swarms, swarm intelligence, etc., etc. What if you take that literally? Okay, I'm not completely mad, but what if you take it literally and excavate the ways in which insects and animals have been embedded in our understanding of media technologies? And it goes at least to 19th century and the birth of modern entomology. And so you can really also, tweak your conceptual coordinates by taking things literally sometimes.
I wondered if you could say something about some sense of an archaeology of information.
Mm-hmm.
Because I like the idea that you talked about that there's sort of a crust almost that's sort of crewing with this obsolete sort of technology, and this idea of the zombie sort of technology.
Mm-hmm.
But I wondered if you could say something about the data that's held on that technology. This
Yeah.
idea that maybe there's a sort of, we're at the beginning of a new deep time that talks about the sort of accrual of information and things like, the idea of the archive and how that is held, how that relates back to the earth because it's held on these hard drives that are made of these minerals that then relate back to deep time. And if we're
Exactly.
at the start of a new deep time, that relates to code and information.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point because that really brings it back to the kind of at the core of the whole debate, right? Okay. In terms of how we came to be, information culture, so much we owe to cybernetics and information theory and 20th century mathematics, from Alan Turing to American cybernetics. And in short, and I'm sure that Alan Turing is now somewhere, turning his grave, but in short, a lot of it boils down to conceptualization of information as non-material, right? And that really influenced a huge amount of the ways in which we talk about digital technologies as well as immaterial, right? That they are non-entropic, they don't obey the same rules as physical things, right? And on a very mathematical level, perhaps that is true, but because we don't live in pure level, in the world of pure mathematics, that kind of operational mathematics is always embedded in things, and things obey physical laws, and things hence deteriorate. So on a very physical level, and this is where it becomes exactly what you said, I think you summed it up already, the archive is by definition a material practice as well, an aside, that is always decaying. Everyone who has, everybody who works in an archive, visited an archive, or somehow in the cultural heritage sector and museums knows that the whole idea of preservation is a myth. There's only preservation through maintenance, right? And this isn't only about digital things that are, preserved nowadays, but any kind of a vase from ancient Greek times is there only with the meticulous work of constant maintenance, right? And that applies to digital technologies and software and information as well. It's not only that, let's say, the floppy disks that we had in 1980s, 1990s are now obsolete in the sense that we don't have the hardware to play them, but also the fact that the actual physical material of the floppy disk is decaying and with an increasing pace, much quicker than most materials anyway. So which brings the question of, and we've got a huge amount of interesting, especially film people, film art, interested in this kind of process of decay. So I think that's where I start with my kind of roundabout archive and digital culture is always the physics, the physicality of things. And that would go back to cloud computing as well. The whole discourse of cloud computing, as the metaphor says, immaterial, non-located on your desktop, etc., etc., is actually being sustained by huge amount of energy consumption by server farms. And server farms are really funky things because obviously it's not only the servers that actually take huge amounts of energy, and a lot of it's still CO2 based actually. So it's every Google search releases a certain amount of CO2 as well. But also that because they get so overheated, you need cooling mechanisms. So servers need to be, obviously they release energy and heat, but also they need to be cooled. And some places like Google, some companies like Google are looking into ecological ways for server farms, storing server farms near rivers and other kind of natural cooling places. So, we need to be linking these up, the whole notions of archive, and actually a lot of the stuff that we are central to art theory as well, and now artistic concepts like archive. What if you, again, follow the long networks of the archive as a conceptual focus of practice, for instance, a memory, right? To these physical, even geological or energetic regimes that sustain it, That's what we need to be tweaking, I think.
It's 25 past 6, and if there are any pressing questions, if you want to hang out with us in the Houseman, if you have genuine pressing questions to ask Jussi, please stay behind. But I think we should now thank Jussi, who's been going for quite a while.
Thank you.
So,
Thanks.